Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest statements from Phillip Hammond, the former Conservative Chancellor, who has said that the general election is nothing to do with getting Brexit done, but to shift the Conservative Party much further to the right wing. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So to begin with, about the general election not being about achieving Brexit, this is certainly true and pretty easy to see. After all, Parliament voted in favour of Johnson's withdrawal agreement bill at the first reading. Now, that doesn't mean that Parliament was too happy with it exactly as it stands. There were to be amendments at the second reading, but it would still have ended up with us exiting the EU and actually exiting the EU by the end of the year, easily within the deadline extension requested for the end of January. Make no mistake, when MPs vote in favour of a bill, they're quite happy for it to succeed. They just sometimes have little issues and that they just want changing. The bill getting through its first reading meant that it was going to go through. But Johnson isn't interested in Brexit as such, only in power. And the people who put him in power are the far-right element that have spent years, decades even, slowly infiltrating the Conservative Party and exerting influence. Something it was denied for quite some time until the party started to elect a series of weak leaders, beginning with David Cameron, who could easily be bullied into actions that were against their own interests. Phillip Hammond is now saying that the general election plan is an attempt to shift the party to the right. He has described the entryism of former Vote Leave crew to replace more moderate MPs with hardliners. Hammond also pointed out that even those who still want to leave the EU should not blame Parliament for the situation, because it's Johnson who pulled his own bill. And this is true. Johnson put his bill before Parliament but wanted it to go through in 3 days. Parliament essentially said they were mostly happy to leave the EU because they voted for it. But there were a couple of points they wanted to check. 3 days, not really long enough to do that. At this point, Boris pulled his own bill. That bill is now dead and buried. His agreement isn't, but the bill is. Remember, if there's a general election, which now there will be, then they can't just pick up where they left off. It's not only a new session of Parliament, it's a new Parliament. They have to start again with the new bill, which of course can be identical, but the process has to start again from the beginning. Hammond further says that Johnson could have kept going with the bill. Even if there were amendments he didn't like attached to it, he could still keep going, have the general election, and if he won the general election, which is the aim from his point of view, and that general election was always coming quite soon anyway, then he could have always changed the amendments later on. So Johnson can't even claim that the general election is about getting the Brexit he wants. It's nothing to do with Brexit. It's entirely to do with how the Conservative Party emerges from that general election. And so Hammond's claim is given credence. It is just a way of making sure that he not only maximises the number of MPs that he has, but specifically gets MPs who will support the hardest of lines without fail. Because that's what Boris Johnson's political masters want. After all, even a majority does him no good if there are moderate Tory MPs who will rebel against his most inhuman legislation. And there'll be plenty of that to come if Johnson manages to acquire real power, become Prime Minister, but with a majority. And given that MPs appear to have hand-delivered now an early Christmas present to Boris Johnson, a general election on his terms, with no bothersome amendments, maybe a little tweak in the date, who cares about that, then there now exists a real danger of that. And finally, before I start to add my own thoughts onto this, Hammond quoted Aaron Banks, leader of Leave.eu, who said, "We have moved heaven and earth to shift the Conservative Party to a Leave party." And now Banks' staff are in key government positions, as well as installed at Conservative Party headquarters. So my own thoughts on this, and I definitely agree with Hammond's assessment, it's strange to think that the Conservatives and Labour have been running parallel with each other in the last few years. Changing election rules so that both parties now end up with feckless leaders who are incapable of running an effective campaign. This has seemed less obvious for the Conservatives because, well, someone has to win an election, and they have had media backing them up to paper over the cracks. You've also seen over the last few years a definite power grab by the extremes of both parties. Now, I could, I suppose, say that at least on the far left in Labour, you can definitely argue that they at least believe that what they're doing is best for the country and for people at large, and they're not acting from entirely selfish motives. The far right know full well that they're stuffing the country and everyone in it, but it makes no practical difference. In their lurch to the extreme wings of their respective parties, they're using the same tactics as each other, and I'm never a fan of saying that the ends justify the means, and they inevitably put off millions of voters. You know, those people you need to get yourself into power. But the far right hope to take advantage of the fact that most voters in the UK want to vote for a party that can get into government. What good is it reading a manifesto for the Liberal Democrats if it's just a wish list with less power than a child's letter to Santa? So many voters vote for either Labour or the Conservatives, without being a fan of either, and just pick whichever one they hate the least for that particular election. And with Labour in disarray, the media on the side of the Conservatives and the Brexiteers, and nice shiny new disinformation campaigns courtesy of a wild west of a social media landscape, the far right have obviously seen their chance to not only mould the Conservative Party in their image, but also get power as well. They'd have had little chance of power in other circumstances. Their position would turn away millions of voters. But if they think those voters aren't really looking anywhere else with greater affection, then they're seeing their chance at real power to completely strip the country of everything it has left. And all for personal profit and influence. Of course, just because that's the plan doesn't mean it'll work. We can take heart from the fact that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings' strategy has returned failure after failure. Their only successes coming with the withdrawal agreement and the general election bills, and even those were gifted them by a disharmonious opposition, not out of any great cunning. So their general election plan may fail as well. The problem is that for me as a socialist, even partial success is a disaster. For Phillip Hammond, the disaster is with a hard Brexit and a hardline Conservative Party emerging and delivering it. For me, Brexit of any kind is a disaster, as is the prospect of more Conservative time in office. And the Conservatives aren't super confident that they'll win. So yesterday, Boris Johnson returned the whip to about half of the Tory rebels for being good, as long as they promise to support the withdrawal agreement, which they all say they will, even though they must know it leads to no deal. Some of these MPs were going to be standing against new Conservative candidates and may well have taken votes away from the party at the general election. So no chances at all are being taken by the Tories here. And so the opposition parties must do likewise now. Otherwise, they are just basically handing the election to Boris Johnson. So my best hope, because I'm not placing any hope in the ability of the opposition parties and Labour in particular to do an effective campaign, even though I'll retain some optimism of it, but it is optimism and nothing more. So my best hope is that the Brexit Party manage to nibble away enough votes from the Conservatives and that they end up on the opposition benches. Whatever Parliament looks like after the general election is not realistically going to be to my liking, but if the pro-Brexit parties are at least on the opposition side, then the situation will have improved. Actually, there is another hope, though not one I'm proud to be having. An election in mid-December. Probably going to be quite cold and certainly gloomy, dark even for much of the day. This, and I'm not proud of this thought, but this may reduce the voting turnout for some elderly voters who overwhelmingly support both the Conservatives and Brexit. And yes, I know, because I keep getting told every time I mention this, that there are elderly citizens who support Remain and not the Conservatives. You wrap up warm and get out there. Or register for postal voting. Shh, don't tell the Brexiteers about that one. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.